most people, the idea of saving the first $100,000 feels less like a financial milestone and more like an impossible destination. The number appears everywhere in books, interviews, and personal finance discussions, often surrounded by the suggestion that everything becomes easier afterward. That idea is sometimes misunderstood as a promise that wealth suddenly accelerates on its own. But the real explanation is much more interesting because it has very little to do with motivation and almost everything to do with mathematics, psychology, and the changing relationship between labor and capital. The first $100,000 does not magically transform a person's life overnight, yet it represents a point where financial systems begin responding differently to the choices being made. The journey toward that number is usually the slowest part, because every dollar must come directly from earned income after taxes, living expenses, and unexpected costs have already taken their share. At the beginning, there is no meaningful investment portfolio creating additional value in the background, which means progress depends almost entirely on human effort. Every extra hour worked, every careful spending decision, and every consistent investment contributes another small piece to a growing foundation. From the outside, this process often looks frustratingly slow because the visible results rarely match the amount of discipline required to create them. This creates one of the strongest psychological barriers in personal finance. Human beings naturally expect effort and reward to move together in a straight line, yet financial growth rarely behaves that way. During the early years, substantial effort may produce only modest, visible progress, making it easy to believe that the system itself is broken. Many people stop investing not because the strategy failed, but because the feedback arrives much more slowly than expected. The mind prefers immediate rewards, while long-term wealth quietly depends on delayed gratification repeated hundreds of times. To understand why the first $100,000 matters, it helps to imagine two engines working together. The first engine is earned income, generated through work, business activity, or professional skills. The second engine is invested capital, which slowly begins producing returns of its own. In the beginning, the first engine does almost all the work, while the second barely moves. As savings accumulate, however, the second engine gradually becomes more powerful until it starts making a noticeable contribution. The milestone is significant because the balance between these two engines begins to shift. Imagine someone investing consistently into a diversified portfolio over many years. During the first stages, annual investment gains may represent only a small fraction of what they personally contribute. Later, as the portfolio grows, market returns can occasionally equal or even exceed an entire year's worth of new contributions. Nothing magical happened on the day the portfolio crossed a specific number. Instead, the mathematics of percentage growth finally became large enough to be visible in everyday life. This is where compound growth is often misunderstood. Many people picture compounding as an explosive curve that suddenly launches upward, but the reality is much quieter. Compounding spends a long time appearing almost invisible before gradually becoming difficult to ignore. The shape of the curve has always been there, yet our perception changes only when the accumulated base becomes large enough for percentage gains to translate into meaningful dollar amounts. The underlying principle remains exactly the same from the first dollar invested to the millionth. Behavioral economics helps explain why reaching this milestone can also influence future financial decisions. As people begin seeing investments produce measurable results, saving often feels less like a sacrifice and more like participation in a system that is finally providing visible feedback. This shift in perception can strengthen long-term habits because the connection between today's decisions and tomorrow's outcomes becomes easier to observe. The mathematics has not changed, but the human experience of the mathematics certainly has. History offers an interesting parallel. Before industrial machinery transformed production, Economic output depended primarily on physical labor. Every additional product required another unit of human effort. The Industrial Revolution changed that relationship by allowing machines to continue producing value after they had already been built. Financial capital behaves in a surprisingly similar way. Building the initial pool of assets requires considerable effort, yet once established, those assets may continue generating returns without requiring proportional increases in labor. The comparison is not perfect, but it illustrates how systems evolve from dependence on direct effort toward greater reliance on accumulated productive resources. Of course, this milestone is not universal. Inflation changes purchasing power across decades, investment returns vary, and individual circumstances differ enormously. $100,000 today does not represent the same economic reality it did 20 years ago, and future decades will reshape the number again. The important lesson is therefore not the exact amount, but the principle behind it. Every financial system contains thresholds where accumulated capital begins influencing outcomes more noticeably than before. There is also an important misconception worth addressing. Reaching $100,000 does not eliminate financial risk, guarantee independence, or ensure future prosperity. Markets fluctuate, careers change, unexpected expenses appear, and economic conditions evolve in ways no individual can fully predict. Wealth is not protected by a single milestone, but by consistent decision-making over many years. The milestone simply marks a stage where the mechanics of growth become easier to recognize. Another psychological benefit comes from identity rather than arithmetic. During the early years, someone may think of themselves as a person trying to save money. After years of consistent investing, they increasingly see themselves as someone who owns productive assets. That subtle change in identity often influences future behavior because people tend to protect identities they have spent years building. Financial habits become part of personal character rather than temporary challenges requiring constant motivation. Perhaps the most valuable lesson hidden inside this milestone is patience. Modern life rewards speed, instant communication, and immediate results, making it surprisingly difficult to appreciate systems that unfold across decades. Wealth creation belongs to the second category. It rarely announces itself through dramatic breakthroughs, but instead emerges from thousands of ordinary decisions repeated with remarkable consistency. The first $100,000 represents the visible evidence of those decisions rather than the source of their success. Seen this way, the milestone is less about celebrating a particular balance and more about understanding how financial systems gradually change as capital accumulates. At first, work performs nearly all the heavy lifting. Later, invested assets begin sharing that responsibility. Neither stage is more important than the other because the second cannot exist without the first. The real mathematics behind the first $100,000 is therefore not a secret formula or a shortcut to wealth, but a reminder that patient accumulation eventually changes the way financial growth itself behaves.